Welcome. Can you hear me? Yes? All good, Christopher? Welcome to our third and final installation of the Abner and Erez Goldstine Scholar in Residence here at Sinai Temple. For those of you who brave the rain, can't hear me? 1 second. Can you read my lips? All good now? Christopher, tell me when. Test, test. Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. Welcome to the third installment and final of this year of the Abner and Erez Goldstine Scholar in Residence. It's been an honor to work on this program with Leslie Wachtel, with Judy Bagan, with, of course, Abner and Erez, and our entire staff to bring Rabbi Artson to our community. No stranger to, of course, not only Barad Hall, but the Sinai community. As you've heard, so many of our rabbis have so many different connections to Rabbi Artson, and as I met Rabbi Guzik early in school, she just gushed over her childhood rabbi, and thankfully over these last 13 years in Los Angeles, Rabbi Artson has also become a mentor of mine as I've watched in action the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies and strengthened that partnership with Sinai Temple. Thank you again for braving the rain. For those of you who are watching either Los Angeles or I know some in the East Coast, we're having a bit of winter here, but it's good for us. This last installment will be what it means to be Jewish in a multi-faith world. So Rabbi Artson will address us, and then I'll have an opportunity to ask a few questions. And then also, please think of your own questions as we have a Q&A to end our Outstanding Scholar in Residence. Without further ado, the Abner and Erez Goldstine Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies Dean, friend of Sinai Temple, Rabbi Bradley Artson.
Thank you, my friends, for braving the storm. I will try to be entertaining and to make it worthwhile. So I want to think about what changes in your religion, your religious identity, when you take seriously that there are other people who have different identities. And that question is relatively new in the Western world. It's new because for a great many Western people, they only know their own co-religionists. So if you grow up Catholic in a Catholic country, Muslim in a Muslim country, that's everyone you know. And there are even places in the world where if you grow up in a sufficiently insular Jewish community, you can think that everybody is Jewish the way you are, and that nobody has a very different approach to life. And because of that, religion in the West has been a zero-sum game. For your religion to be right, everyone else's has to be wrong. For you to go to heaven, they have to go to somewhere else. I want to tell you a story that I don't feel good about now, but it exemplifies this religious approach. I was a newly ordained rabbi. I moved out from New York, where I was ordained, and moved to Mission Viejo, which is a small suburban community halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego. Very beautiful, beautiful bedroom community. And I got a call from Dennis Prager, who ran a show called Religion on the Line. Some of you may remember that. And it was a radio program that took place late at night on a Sunday night, I think. And it always involved a rabbi and a priest and a minister. And he invited me to play the part of a rabbi, which I have been doing more or less successfully for several decades now. So I went, I was very excited, and the priest looked like he was from Central, casting, kind, loving, nice older gentleman, meaning more or less my age now. And the minister looked like a Ken doll, like in Barbie and Ken. He had the perfect blonde hair. He had that body. He looked like he had stepped off the tennis court moments before. And he came with a shiny, skinny New Testament. And the first thing I thought when I saw that was, next time around, I want to be part of a religion where my entire library can fit in one book. If I were to bring my religious library, I would have shopping carts full of books, and I still would have to leave a lot at home. But he started teaching standard, hardcore Protestant teaching, which is that if you don't accept Jesus, then you'll go to hell. And I tried to be polite, but that does seem like a rather rude thing to say, particularly because it became evident during the evening that he not only included me in that, but he also thought that the Catholic priest didn't believe in Jesus in the right way and was going to wind up in a neighborhood adjacent to my own. So if you get me mad in an ideological argument, I become a little bit medieval, which is to say, I don't argue to understand, I argue to crush. And it turns out I have a good education. So I set up a trap for the Ken doll minister. I said to him, are you telling me that if you don't accept Jesus as your personal savior, then you go to hell, no exceptions? And he, being true to his teaching, said, yes, that's what I'm telling you. I said, okay, what about Pocahontas? You remember Pocahontas? Through no fault of her own, generations of Native Americans didn't have the chance to accept Jesus as their personal savior. From the time he was crucified to the time Europeans came to this continent, there's a good 1,600 years in which Native Americans were born, lived their life, went about their business, and died without ever being asked, do you accept Jesus Christ and his atoning sacrifice as your salvation? They didn't know about it. And here I had him trapped, because he could either say, well, there's an exception for those people, in which case he knew that what I would do is start to come up with other exceptions, or he'd have to hang tough, which he did. He said, no, it pains me to say it, but all those Native Americans who lived and died not knowing there was Jesus, they're all in hell. At which point, the phone banks lit up, and I didn't have to say anything for the rest of the evening. Nothing but Christians on the phone screaming at this guy about how heartless he was. Now, if we could just be among ourselves for a moment, that feels kind of gratifying, doesn't it? Show him. But there's something dirty about it. There's something unworthy about that kind of a triumph. It wouldn't be so hard to engineer the argument in which I'd be on the other side of that, in which I could be made to look foolish for some Jewish teaching. And the idea that my religion being right must mean that every other religion is wrong, worthless, error, misleading, leads to a world of inquisitions and crusades and disputations and endless conflict. And for most of human history, that has been the way people talk about their faith and their identity. One is right, all the others are garbage. There are winners and losers in the religion world. And that's not just a matter of the past, that is true in our time as well. You can look far afield, look at what's happening in Iran today, as people who try to be good Muslims, but they don't want to do it the way the people leading the current regime want them to. Women who would like to walk around without their hair necessarily covered all the time, which is not a mandate of Islam. People are being executed. People are being hauled away. People are being beaten and murdered, right? And that's because the people leading the government are very religious. And you can look at some of the things that some of our brothers and sisters within some sectors of Judaism are saying about other Israelis or other Jews. And it's equally intolerant and it's equally cruel. And of course, I have had students who converted from Christianity, and when they told their parents that they didn't believe in Jesus, their parents kicked them out of their house. I had a student who at the age of 14 was shown the door. So religion, which I think many of us think should be something that makes us resilient in our love, able to see the good in ourselves and others, capable of greater patience and wisdom, is often the very thing that generates intolerance and cruelty and hatred. So tonight, what I want us to think about is a different way of thinking about religion that gets us out of the zero-sum kind of hostility that is still so prevalent in the world. And I want to introduce you to the thinking of two great people, one of whom wrote on this subject, but nobody knows it, so I'm going to reveal to you a secret. Another guy who gets quoted all the time, but he wrote about it 20 years later without citing the first, so I'm just going to correct the historical record here. In 1916, Martin Buber, great Jewish existentialist, wrote an essay called Jewish Religiosity. And in it, he made the interesting argument that religion is something often rigid, often exclusive, often pretends like it has a monopoly on the creator of the universe, as opposed to religious, which for him is the human ability to feel wonder, to feel marvel, to look at another person and see someone like yourself, to be able to have a new idea or a new insight. So he writes, I want to read you 3 paragraphs of his. Religiosity is man's sense of wonder and adoration, an ever-anew becoming, an ever-anew articulation and formulation of his feeling that, transcending his conditioned being, yet bursting from its very core, there is something that is unconditioned. Religiosity is our longing to establish a living communion with the unconditioned, our will to realize the unconditioned through our action, transposing it into the world of man. So religiosity for Buber is very different than religion. Religion is, are you wearing a garment that has linen and wool in it? If so, God is mad at you. Did you put on tefillin this morning? If not, we need to talk. And every religion has its category of religion, which can be a fine way to remember religiosity. But when they get disconnected, says Buber, religion becomes ugly. Religion becomes toxic. As opposed to that, he says that religion is the sum total of the customs and teachings articulated and formulated by religiosity of a particular era for a particular people. Its prescriptions and dogmas are rigidly determined and handed down as unalterably binding to all future generations, without regard for their newly developed religiosity, which seeks new forms. It's an interesting thought. Think with me. The Judaism that we've inherited has a lot of practices that we've inherited. For some of us, the smell of a kitchen on a particular day of the week lets us know what day of the week it is. Or right before a particular holiday, and we bring out certain foods that we only see that time of year. You don't even have to be religious to see that. In my family, everyone in my family will tell you that their favorite meal of the year is Thanksgiving. The turkey, the stuffing, all of that. How often do we make that favorite meal? Once a year. It's our favorite meal. So one year, we decided Shira was away in college for Thanksgiving, so when she came home for winter break, we did Thanksgiving in the middle of January, which felt, I don't know, a little dirty. People tend to take experiences or insights, harden them into practice, and then they treat the practice as what matters. And they forget the experience that gave birth to the practice. And they forget that other people are having experiences all the time, which means the practices should be open to change across time, to incorporate those new insights, that dynamism. In 1934, the pragmatist philosopher John Dewey wrote a book called A Common Faith. And in that, he distinguishes between religion and the religious. Sounds a lot like Buber to me. He's very critical of religion. Religions tend to monopolize. Religions work with force or with wealth or with prestige to manipulate people and to make them feel bad, right? Why weren't you at shul on Shabbos? Instantly, a whole bunch of people go cold, right? And we do it to people we love. We often do it unintentionally. As opposed to religious, which we all share. Any of you who are on Facebook know that you get bombarded every time there's a decent sunset. 30 people are going to put a picture of that sunset up on Facebook because it's too beautiful not to share. Have you ever been around new parents? I'll let you in on something. You will never take a picture as cute as the baby, ever. But that doesn't stop parents and grandparents from trying again and again and again, and then sharing those pictures with anyone who will sit still to look at them. Right? We all do it. The response we have to a sunset, or a baby, or to seeing a dear friend who we haven't seen in a long time, that links us to each other and to all people. It doesn't matter what culture you're in. It doesn't matter what your traditions are. Every human being has those responses in which we feel that we're part of something bigger. That, says Dewey, is religious. And religion is what happens when it gets brittle and frozen and harsh, and then that divides us up. And many of us reject religion because of that. Many of us notice the way it divides people, the way it creates antagonism, the way it makes for competitive camps, and they say, I want nothing to do with it. The first talk I gave to you, I mentioned the studies that show that Jews who claim to be of no religion is the most rapidly growing group within Jewish life. A quarter of the Jews who respond to the studies today say, I'm Jewish, but no religion. And then here's the Buber-Dewey insight. But 95% of them say being Jewish is very important to them. So what's going on? What is that? And what are we supposed to do in the face of that? And here what I'd like to tell you is there's a Jewish answer to that. Here is what I think is one of the most radical statements in the entire Mishnah. In Masechet Sanhedrin, which is that volume of the Mishnah that deals with Jewish civil society and our relationships to the world, there's a famous line that the righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come. How is that possible? How is it possible that someone who says Jesus is the only way to achieve salvation and is a really nice person, that person has a place in the world to come? And someone who says there's only one God and Muhammad is his prophet, that person has a place in the world to come. And the person who doesn't believe in God but looks out for a neighbor has a place in the world to come. How can the Talmud say that? The answer is that the Talmud is making a shift. Religion is not about true or false. Religion is about nurturing the best aspects of ourselves and each other. And if your religion makes you a better person, then the Talmud says, you go. Do it. We don't need to agree with the claims of other religions. We need to hold them accountable to compassion and decency. And they need to hold us accountable in the same way. Nobody cares how tightly you put on your tefillin if you're cruel to the people in your life. But if you need the tefillin to remind you who you're supposed to be, and I do, then that's wonderful, do it. It shifts religion if we think about it that way, because at that point then, religion is about helping us to cultivate gratitude. It's a set of practices that point us in a direction. But someone else can cultivate gratitude with a very different set of practices. For some, that will mean going to church. For some, it will mean meditating in an ashram. For some, it might mean dancing, or going to theater, or taking a hike, or even sleeping in. Right? We all find ways to nourish our best attributes. And that religiousness, I want to reinforce from a second source. There are two great schools of ancient rabbis, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And we've been raised early on to love Beit Hillel and to diss Beit Shammai. Next time you're in Israel, you go to the Knesset, you'll take a look at that great big beautiful menorah. You remember the one I'm talking about, the one with all the little statues on it? And there's a big statue of Hillel and Shammai, and standing on one foot, right? Which Hillel does to show how patient he is, right? But here's what I want to say. Do you know why the Talmud says we follow Beit Hillel and not Beit Shammai? When they have an argument in Jewish law, we always follow Beit Hillel. It's not because Beit Hillel is right. It's not. The Talmud doesn't claim that Hillel is right and Shammai is wrong. It says that Beit Hillel always taught the teachings of Beit Shammai first before they taught their own. And any group of people who could be that considerate, that kind, those are people you should listen to. So we follow Beit Hillel not because they're right, but because they're sweet and gentle and generous. That's amazing too. Don't take my word for it. Shlomo ibn Gabirol, one of the great sages of the medieval period, writes, "Don't be ashamed to receive the truth from any source, even from an inferior person." He couldn't help himself. He came very close, right? Truth from any source. Maimonides says the same thing in his Shmona Prakim. Accept the truth from whatever source it comes from. That's a very different notion of what religion means. Religion doesn't mean I have to agree with what you believe in. But if what you believe in makes you a mensch, then I want to encourage you. I want to help you along the way. In college, I had 2 roommates who were evangelical Christians. And they were an important part of my becoming observant. I grew up in a pretty anti-religious household and discovered my religion when I was an undergraduate, in part because of these 2 wonderful souls. And it never occurred to me to believe what they believed. But I watched what their religiousness did for them. And I said, I want some of that. And that's what made me go talk to the rabbi at Hillel. What if religion isn't about competing for who's right? What if we each look to our traditions to help us become the best version of ourselves? And we let other people figure out where they need to go to become the best version of who they are. You don't have to worry about where they're going to get that. There's a fascinating teaching that I learned from a Muslim chaplain at Duke University, a man named Abdullah Antepi, who is one, I think, of the heroes of America today. He was for many years a Muslim chaplain. He started a program at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem to take Muslim clergy to Jerusalem to learn Jewish history and thought because he thought it would help make them better Muslims. And this group continues every summer to this day. He said to me, and I know he said it to a lot of people, that in the 20th century, humanity gave God a great gift. And that gift was the reconciliation of Christianity and Judaism. It came out of the Shoah. It came after a lot of pain and murder and suffering. But the organized Catholic and Christian churches turned in dialogue to Judaism as to an older sibling. And it's not surprising in this country to meet Christians who love Jews and Judaism, who go to bat for us when there's an anti-Semitic incident, when Israel is assaulted unfairly. It's often our Christian brethren who stand with us and make sure we're not alone. Not a coincidence that when Georgia re-elected its senator, who is also a minister, that in his acceptance speech, the first time he gave an acceptance speech, he quoted the 30th Psalm, joy comes in the morning. And this last one, he talked about the fraternity of Jews and blacks in the civil rights movement, while he was accepting being elected by Georgia. So Abdullah Antepli says, 20th century, the gift humanity gave God was the reconciliation of Christianity and Judaism. And he says this to Muslim audiences, the gift God is waiting for now is the reconciliation of Islam and Judaism. And God is waiting. I think he's able to do that because he understands that for him, Islam is vital to his being his most authentic self. But he explained this event in history, and he's free to be curious and ask me those questions too. Imagine if we could set ourselves free. Imagine if religion was no longer right at the expense of every other way of thinking and being. It was simply beautiful for me, for you, for us. And then we share it however we want to share it. And we live in a world in which other people making different choices, either different ways to be Jewish, or non-Jews who choose entirely different pathways, even frankly Jews who choose different pathways. What if we could see our religion as teaching us to be interested, curious, exploring, wanting to learn, wanting to know? And then it opens up dialogues in which we might be able to take some of what they teach us and say, hey, you know, that exists in my tradition too. I've had conversations with Christian theologians who are process theologians. They talk an awful lot about love. But armed with those conversations, I go back and I look in our scriptures, and you know what? There's a lot of love in there. It's just that we Jews don't think we can talk about it. So talking to Christians, I think, has made me a better Jew. It's allowed me to see things that were invisible. So the way we maintain our integrity and live in a world of multi-faith and of no faith is to turn a corner. It's not zero-sum. It's not about true or false. Is there something beautiful and wise that animates us in our journey? And is there something beautiful and wise in others that we might learn from, mimic, take with us? I hope so, because I think that there's a lot that all of us seekers can gain from each other if we just open ourselves and we start to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I get to ask questions because you told me to, but also it seems like it's the obligation of us, not just as Jews, but living as Jews in this multi-faith world. First thing I want to ask is about necessity versus desire. Because I'm thinking just in my own rabbinate here at Sinai Temple, when we engage with the outside world of other faiths, it's often in necessity. We created an amazing partnership with the Church of the Good Shepherd, a Catholic church in Beverly Hills, only because the priest came here after the Tree of Life shooting. When that happened, we said we have to go there, and now we call it covenant work of feeding the homeless. It's MLK weekend coming up. We invite churches from the black community. The Ukrainian-Russian war started. Let's bring our faiths together. There's no indoor space at Sinai Temple. Let's ask the Church of LDS for their baseball field and create that outdoor service that you mentioned. All moments of necessity. but moments of necessity became moments of desire when we want to do this.
Yes.
So how do we start with the moments of desire to be curious and maybe something that we sometimes fear?
Look, it's, I think, human nature. We're all of us busy. We're all overwhelmed doing all the things we have to be doing. So it's not unusual that it's a crisis that makes us take time for a question that we should have asked, but we didn't have time for. So the first thing I want to do is congratulate you again, because there are plenty of people who, in such moments of crisis, shrink back. And the fact that you can rattle off 4 different times where a crisis made you expand, and that you didn't respond with fear and defensiveness, but you said, how can we use this to connect deeper, more broadly? How can we affirm shared humanity in the face of that crisis? That says something about, well, it says something about the rabbis. It says something about the community. But I guess what I'd invite you to is to make time without there having to be a crisis. What if you created a circle of people and you sat down and you said, let's dream? What would real interfaith engagement look like if it wasn't driven by necessity or by sporadic achievement, right? So for example, there are enormous vulnerabilities in the Jewish community all year long. And there's enormous vulnerabilities in the African American communities all year long. What if we don't think about it as a once-a-year event? What if we use that event to create an actual relationship in which throughout the years we're learning together, we're working together, we're thinking about things we can do in the community together that we could do more successfully than separately? I think part of it is, how do we then go the second step? The first step is the crisis happens and we respond to the crisis with a particular response. But the next one is then, now how do we build on that to make it something ongoing and pervasive?
And so what about the aspect of fear? Sometimes I get, look, Rabbi, you can't go to that church. You can't go to that mosque. You can't engage with that because that's scary to us. We might assimilate. Children meet our children. Where does that aspect of fear fit in terms of us as Jews? You talked about yesterday for a long time the idea of chosenness. And then on Shabbat, you talked about this idea of bringing color, those moments through the black and white. What moments of color do we have to bring through so that we have our own strength in order to also lessen the fear of, if you wish, the other?
So I don't think this is unique to Jews, but I think we have our unique flavor of it. You can look at the trace of Jewish history across the last several thousand years, and you can see an endless series of suffering. And that's real. You're not imagining that, that's real. And you can be so focused on the repeated suffering, the banishments, the rape, the pillaging, the stealing, the murders, that that's all you see. It may be my temperament, but what I see is a people who refuse to be defeated. The fact that we're all here is extraordinary. And so I'm still optimistic about Judaism and the Jewish people. And admittedly, I have the best Jewish job in the world, no offense. But I sit in a pretty place, and then some of the most talented young people in the world show up and say, hi, I want to give my life to the Jewish people. Will you help me do that? So I have a pretty awesome job. But I think what that optimism does for me is I'm not afraid even of talking to people with whom I differ. When I worked in politics for 2 years before going to rabbinical school, I was a legislative aide to the Speaker of the State Assembly, to Willie Brown.
Also 15 votes or just one?
He did it in the first time all around, and he did it with the Republican coalition, too. Willie used to say, the person on the other side of the aisle is not my enemy, they're my opponent. Mm-hmm. And I may be opposed to them on the bill that's in front of us now, but I'm going to need them next week for the bill that's coming up next week. So I think we have created too many litmus tests as a way of trying to shield ourselves from disappointment and hurt and vulnerability. But I don't think that's the way bold people work in the world. I think we have to say, on this point, we have a common interest or a common viewpoint, so we can partner on this, even though next week I'm going to fight you on that. Mm-hmm. And I think to the degree that we can allow ourselves to talk to people, some of whose views we find problematic, that's important. And look, can we be honest here? If people at Sinai never talked to anyone with whom they differed or who they found to be obnoxious, then Kiddush would be silent too.
Maybe that's why our Kiddush is pretty small here.
Could be. I think you got to work on it. But you learn from the people with whom you differ.
Right.
And if you start by emphasizing points of commonality, the other trait of human nature is that when you have something that's a shared project, it actually makes it harder for them to mischaracterize you the next time around. So I think it actually helps with that other problem too, but even if it didn't, I think we need to drop our litmus test policy.
Based on litmus tests, the Israel question comes up. I know it came up yesterday. I know it came up on Shabbat. Just in personal experience, when we have invited other faith leaders to this community, I've actually gotten 2 different reactions. One was more from an evangelical side, saying, I'm dropping everything and coming here. It was during the Gaza war. We had an amazing Friday night Shabbat service. And another faith leader, a good friend of mine, said, you know what? Israel is political for my faith community. I'm just going to sit this one out. Where does Israel fit in terms of the Jewish community interacting with the multi-faith? Is it a non sequitur, you just don't talk about it? Or do we bring that in when needed?
So if we go with what I said a moment ago about we find allies for common issues, mm-hmm. but for the next issue, we leave that issue aside. Mm-hmm. Look, I do love Israel, and I think that Israel is a vital part of Jewish identity, and that we need to support a democratic and Jewish Israel and the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. And I'm aware that there are things that Israel does that I think are wrong. And I think, though, that the place for those conversations, for me, is one-on-one. Mm-hmm. What if the Sinai clergy were to meet with ministers who had a very different political take on Israel, and instead of trying to just convince them, here, I'm going to teach you the right way to think about Israel, was let's exchange views. You ask about why I think what I think, knowing what you've just said, and I'll ask you why you think, knowing what I'm going to tell you. And that if we build relationships, it doesn't mean we won't disagree with each other, but demonization works in 2 ways, right? I mean, one of the easiest ways to get Jews to leave your table is to either serve or not serve Ben and Jerry's, right? So you should think about it. If you
Soda streams off the table?
If you're inviting someone who you don't want to have, you want to figure out how they stand on that, and then you just kind of set it out on the table or not. But I wonder what the world could be like if we could just talk about those things, right? And have conversations. And it may be that they're not going to come here to support Israel in the Gaza war. Or maybe they'll make a more limited statement about the Gaza war. But maybe you can have them be in relationship on other issues that you share, and then use that as a chance to meet with them and say, what would you be prepared to say? Right? I think we often present ultimatums, and then we get presented ultimatums, and it doesn't work in either direction. We don't like to be told, either you agree to X or you're an enemy of our people, but we do that to people a lot.
Right.
I don't think it's a useful strategy. I think it ends up hardening positions on both sides.
It seems like it's the religiosity question, that religion is the hardening piece, but the religiosity is the softening of the piece.
Yeah, and part of it could be acknowledging that Jewish liberation isn't perfect and has led to a high cost for some of our neighbors. That doesn't mean we don't have the right to have our own state. It just means we should take their pain seriously too, and maybe that would open them to listening to the way that their struggle has created victims on our side too. I think we all get into this kind of propagandistic form of conversation. And I guess what I'd like us to be is not so afraid. You know, we should be alarmed and we should be paying attention. But Jews in this country, Jews in Israel, thank God, are not weak. Right? We are not weak and we're not alone. And so we can act like people who have some strength and some capacity to determine our own destiny.
So you spoke a lot about curiosity for us to other faiths, but it seems like these days there's a lot of curiosity of those faiths to us.
Huge.
My mom likes to say a shul is a place to play and to pray. It seems like Shabbat, the dinner table, is a place to play and then to pray. What do you take account for not just Jews rediscovering their Jewish roots or their curiosity, but this fascination, if you wish, with our religion leading to then religiosity for other faiths looking at us?
We live in an amazing time. The way the world often looks at Jewish tradition, Jewish teaching, is mind-boggling. And I think what ends up happening is sometimes we've been so trained to expect hatred that we just don't trust it. You know, I know that on an airplane, the worst thing I can hear from someone is something overtly anti-Semitic, but the second worst thing I can hear is someone sees my kippah and says out of the blue, you know, I love the Jewish people. It's like, oh, don't sit next to me. But I think part of what has happened is we live in a time in which people have, and partly the internet makes this possible, we don't live in isolation anymore. So just one weird example, I have a public figure Facebook page, and I have over 75,000 likes because I'm very easy to like. And I would say a good half of those people,
Right.
maybe more, are not Jewish.
Yep.
And frankly, I've been surprised at how many of them come from Arabic countries, how many of them are Palestinians, right? And what I try to do is I try to take wisdom from Jewish tradition that pertains to how to be a good person. So I use that page to show that Judaism has something to say about human thriving. And I all the time get I get kooky anti-Semitic messages all the time too, but I get unsolicited messages. I have a guy in India who's a Hindu who once a month asks me for a blessing. I have a guy in Saudi Arabia who says he's never met a Jew, but I'm his rabbi. which I hope he doesn't say too often. But how amazing that we live in a world in which someone who doesn't know any Jews knows that Jews have created a vibrant culture that's helped us to thrive, and they say, I'd like to know about that. That Rabbi Wolpe talked yesterday about the Dalai Lama's ongoing interest in the project of the Jewish people. But he's not alone in that. A lot of people look to us and want to know, how did you survive all of that hatred, all of that wandering, and keep intact? So I think we can walk around with a great deal of legitimate pride, and that people want to share that. And the other thing that's changed is people are willing to learn without thinking they need to switch from column A to column B, right? So just because someone is asking me questions doesn't mean they're thinking of converting to Judaism. They're happy with who they are. They're just really interested, and they think it might be useful in their own life, that piece, right? And vice versa. I know that my Jewish life has been deeply enriched by Eastern spirituality, by Christianity, by Islam, by Native American practice. I think I'm a better Jew because of those things. Just to go back to the Israel story in a way that no one will expect coming. So the tribe on whose land we stand now, the Tongva tribe, they started a program where non-native people can make a contribution as a guest offering of gratitude. And I decided that was a good idea. So Alana and I, 4 times a year, we make a modest contribution to the Tongva tribe as a way to say, I'm aware that this was your land and that I'm living my life on it, and I just want to acknowledge that and say thank you. I got a letter back from the tribe and the tribe's representative, and his last lines on the letter were Shabbat Shalom.
Wow.
Which last time I checked is not Native American for anything. So I called him up, and it turns out he is Native American and converted.
Wow.
Go figure. But we do live in an age in which I think about Jews and our indigenous relationship to the land of Israel, and Native Americans and their complicated indigenous relationship to the land here. And that's actually deepened my appreciation for how Israel makes us a grounded people, whether we live there or not. That all human beings have some place that they're indigenous, or the concept means nothing. And however long you wander and however far you wander, there's somewhere in the world where you're indigenous. Now, I don't think that means other people can't also be indigenous in that same place. Multiple people can have the same land. But I know where I'm indigenous, and I know that my reading of Native American culture and fiction and writing has deepened my Zionism. So I think that's the way, the world I want to live in is a world in which we're just teaching each other all the time.
I want to ask one last question, then if you have any questions, where's Christopher? He has a microphone. Yeah, Christopher will have a microphone, so just raise your hand if you have a question. I want to bring it back to a lot of, or some things that have been said about religiosity making us good people. But we can also say we don't need religion or religiosity. Anybody can be a good person.
Yeah.
So I guess my final question is, then why do we need any of this? Why do we need religion? Yes, tefillin can remind me of wonder. And
you're not going to like my answer.
Then they'll ask the next questions.
So here's what I have to say, and maybe I say this because I'm no longer working at a congregation, I don't know. I think the notion of having to make a case for why we need Judaism is a desperate move and unworthy of our tradition, right? If Judaism doesn't make you happy, then go away. Go find what makes you happy. And the idea that we should be hawking perfectly contented people to tell them your life would be better if you just did it my way, that just feels, I don't know, desperate. So I'd like to say something different. I'd like to say the fact that I chose to be an observant traditional Jew, second only to my choosing to be Ilana's husband, was the greatest and most transformative choice of my life. And if anyone's interested, believe you me, I am more than happy to share with you. But you have to be interested. So I'm not going to try to convert you. And the paradox is, once people know that, then I'm safe to have a conversation with, because I'm not trying to latch onto them and not let them go. So I surprise parents of teenagers all the time, because I tell the teenager, if it makes you miserable, don't do it. And that's not why they brought them to Rabbi Artson, right? But then I go on to say, let me tell you, what about Judaism makes me so happy and lets me live with my anxieties and gives me hope and makes me thankful and helps me celebrate. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine. My father passed away last January. And some of you from Barad Hall remember him. He used to sit right back there, and he loved the services here every year. He would come down from Sonoma to be here for it. And I would not have survived the year of mourning had it not been for Ikar and my community. They swooped in and they picked us up and they carried us through every step of that year in ways large and small, and I know that Sinai does that for its members too. My brother's mother passed away 3 weeks ago. They don't have a community. So he went to work the next day, and they still haven't had a gathering or anything. And he talks about how he feels unsettled, like there's nothing to do with his grief. And so I've said to him, look, my community is big enough that I can share it. Why don't you don't have to make a commitment to a regular practice. You wake up on a Saturday morning wishing there was something you could do to honor your mother. We'll be sitting in the same spot in Ikar. Come sit with us and say Kaddish, right? I think there's enough about our communities that sell themselves if we can get out of the language of fear and coercion. It makes us sound desperate.
So we're going to open it up to a few questions.
Check 1, 2, check 1, 2.
There we go. Yeah. Oh.
They're bringing you a microphone.
So the people at home can hear too. Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about something you'd mentioned a while ago about good people from different religions would then be able to be accepted in the hereafter. And I'm not sure what Judaism, what we believe as the hereafter. I'm very confused about that.
Yes.
Can you help?
I can help to some degree. Let's admit that the grammatical phrase, what do we believe about an afterlife, is a complicated sentence. I can tell you what I believe, and I can tell you what different Jews across the ages have believed, but I can't tell you what we believe. You're going to have an opinion. But what I can tell you is that for most of its history, most of its teachers have affirmed that we do not end at the grave, and that in some way we continue in God's mind, in our own identity. Some people think of Gan Eden as a spiritual space. Some people think of eternity as a different mode of being in time. I take great comfort. I know my father did as he was facing his death, thinking that he would be reunited with his parents and with his deceased wife. And to my mind, it is a feature of God's love that we are greater than our mortality. And I'm pretty radical about that. I don't think that just pertains to people. I think that pertains to all living things. I expect my dogs to be there when I die too. But I will just, one last thing. This may sound a little too mystical for some, I apologize. In my life, I've certainly had dreams of loved ones who have died, but I've also sometimes woken up with the feeling that it wasn't a dream, it was a visit. And I see no reason to pick that apart. So from time to time, my grandmother visits me, and that gives me great consolation. So I also expect upon death to be reunited in some way that we can't understand at the moment, any more than a fetus in the womb could possibly understand what life would be like after birth. Are we passing the mic to?
Yep. Back.
Rabbi, how do you define Olam Haba to a non-believer? And my second question following to the first is why bad things happen to good people and vice versa?
These are two excellent questions. I just need to remind everybody that I'm 63, so if you ask two questions, I'll remember the second. So, I believe that God welcomes into Olam Haba everybody. I don't think there's a criteria of belief at the door, and you have to checklist, yes, I think this, no, I think that. I also think our tradition teaches, it's an interesting rabbinic teaching. The rabbis teach that the longest someone is in Gehenna is 11 months. And at that point, they are purged of their sinfulness, and then they go to paradise. So at some point, sooner or later, everyone winds up in Gan Eden, except for the thoroughly wicked. We can all name who we think that is. And they just stop existing. They are obliterated upon death. So I expect everyone will be in paradise. I don't think we're all being graded. Why do bad things happen to good people? My goodness. That's more than I can do in an answer right now. But there have been different people who've given different answers to that. The most popular answer that I think isn't helpful is that God respects human freedom. And so God lets us make choices. I find that answer utterly unhelpful. And I don't for the life of me understand how anyone after the Shoah could dare to say it out loud. I believe in a God who works with nature and in nature. And so I don't think God is in charge of everything that happens. And I think, as the Talmud says, nature follows its own course, as a result of which both good and bad people suffer. And the question is, what are you going to do with that? So when Jacob was younger and was asking why would God give him autism, I would tell him what I believe, which is I don't believe in a God who gives some people autism and some people the Nobel Prize. I believe that we're all born with certain genetics and our genetics play out. But I also believe in a God who will never abandon us. And I've watched my son grow to do all kinds of things that the experts said he would never be able to do because he never gave up. And in that regard, Jacob was made in God's image.
Gary, and then so 2 more questions, and then we'll conclude.
Rabbi Artson, just want to go back to the quote you gave from Masechet Sanhedrin, that all people have a place in the world to come. So I always thought that Judaism teaches, or halakha, applies to Jews, and there's 7 Noahide laws that apply to non-Jews. So I guess the first question is, why is that statement radical? But if we're talking about, let's say, different practices among Jews, and let's say going into the discussion you had from Buber about religiosity, what does that say about the nature of halakha when we separate religion and religiosity, if people have different paths and we have a halakhic system? So I don't know.
So again, I'm going to answer that personally, because different rabbis would answer that in different ways. I'm a pretty traditional halakhic Jew. You know, most days I pray 3 times a day. I put on tefillin in the morning. I keep kosher in my stomach and my mouth, not just in my house. I follow the halakha pretty detailed. I don't do it because I think I'll get a reward. I take seriously that the Talmud says mitzvah goreret mitzvah. The reward for a mitzvah is the mitzvah. So Jewish law gives me pride, it gives me joy, it gives me a way to structure my life so that I remember who I am all the time. So that for me, being Jewish isn't what I do on the weekend, or it's not what I do at this time, and it just walks with me everywhere, and I love that. So I don't do it because I think there's some extraneous reward waiting for me. And let me turn that around and ask you a question, Jerry. What is the moral position of a saint who gets paradise? This is in medieval literature. They're up in heaven. You can look on Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, all these very happy saints at the top near the ceiling, and they're all looking down at these miserable people who are being dragged into hellfire. What's the saint to do in that moment? What would be the saintly thing to say when you notice that your loved ones are being dragged into eternal torment? I think the only decent thing to do at that point is to say, I'll go with them. Right? I think it's immoral to go to heaven if everyone can't. Besides which, I'm not the first stand-up comic to notice that all the interesting people are going to be in hell.
Okay, last question.
I have a question about your talk. I think it's very aspirational to have groups essentially learn from others, Jews living together with Christians and Muslims and Hindus. I think it's very aspirational and it's very relevant and it makes a lot of sense. But where the rubber sort of meets the road is in the intersection, in the real-life intersection between these groups. And one place where that happens is in assimilation and intermarriage, not necessarily just for the Jews. Catholics are very upset about that. Muslims decry intermarriage with others. And there's an element of survival in this whole question, which wasn't addressed in this aspirational aspect. How do we deal with that very human thing when humans live with each other and decide to intermarry and adopt each other's religions, and especially for Jews as we are a minority?
That is an enormous, enormous question. I have a lot to say on it, most of which I'm going to not. What I will tell you is that we need to start an honest conversation about whether our current approach is helpful or not. 70% of American Jews are intermarrying, and nobody says I'm calling off the marriage because my parents' rabbi won't officiate. So what we have been doing has not stopped the process, and we had better figure out a better way to help keep these people and their children engaged. Let me close with my story. I fall back on this all the time. why I love America and what interfaith relations means to me. I grew up with two very dear friends who are still my best friends, Martin Kohut and Hans Baldauf, neither of whom are Jewish. And we went to school together from the second grade all the way through high school. We stayed in touch. We were at each other's weddings. We've been to life cycle events. We talk once a week without fail. When Alana and I were engaged to get married, Mrs. Baldauf, who was blue blood Protestant, called up and said she wanted to do the rehearsal dinner for us. And I thought that was lovely. And the total number of people in my family who keep kosher is me and Alana. So I decided I wouldn't say anything. I'd eat vegetables. I didn't need to eat the main course, and no one else would care. So she had it at her home, beautiful home in northern part of San Francisco. And she had me give her the guest list, and she opened her house to everyone. It was a lovely evening. And as we're standing in line to get the food, she comes up to me and she says, I want you to know the dishes are brand new. I went to the kosher butcher for the chicken, and there's no dairy in anything. And I tell that story because that's my experience of America. I can tell you more such stories. My college roommate, Bill Maloney, and Mrs. Maloney in Sudbury, who had me to her house for a meal, and she had everyone on the buffet line, and there was a piece of chicken on a separate plate, and when someone went to take it, she said, no, that's for Brad, that's fish. I have found this country to be extraordinary in its welcome and sincere in its respect. So I guess I want us to live not like we're fleeing from where we fled, but to really acknowledge where we've been welcomed and to be able to live like free people in a free place. Thanks, everybody.
I want to thank Rabbi Bradley Artson and Ben Bait, a member of our community at Sinai Temple, Barad Hall, and Abner and Raz Goldstine, a Yasher Koach. And thank you for your generosity, for your vision, and for your kindness to this community as well. Get home safely, and Shabbat Shalom on Monday.